Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short audio presentation, we're going to cover the topic of bankruptcy. In some cases, of course, early-stage ventures don't succeed. And this can obviously be a source of considerable stress and anxiety and financial difficulty for the entrepreneurs. Regardless, it's an important thing to understand going in particular in terms of how what happens to the various assets and financial resources of the organization if the company actually does have to declare bankruptcy. So real briefly, we're going to walk through two of the types of bankruptcies and talk about what goes on. So what do you do if your business doesn't succeed? Well, if you don't owe anyone any money, you can simply shut the business down. If you owe money to other organizations or people, whether those are partners or suppliers or employees, and you have the funds to pay them off, then you do so, and then you shut the business down. The challenge comes when you owe money, but you don't have enough funds to pay off your various debts. Your best case scenario usually is to try to negotiate a settlement, to contact your various creditors and to say, look, we're shutting the business down, we don't have enough money to operate, we owe you this much money, would you accept a smaller amount instead? If you can manage a negotiated settlement with the people and companies that you owe money to, you have a nice, clear outcome. The organization is released from all liabilities. And the real benefit, of course, is that you can avoid legal fees, both for yourself and for the people that you owe money to. Unfortunately, some situations, creditors may not be willing to negotiate a settlement. There's a variety of reasons. If it's a significant amount of money, if they're desperate to get it, and there could be other factors. And in those situations, then, usually there are relatively few options other than to declare bankruptcy. There are actually three different types of bankruptcy, two of which are really business bankruptcies, and the third is personal. Chapter 7 bankruptcy is referred to as a liquidation. Chapter 11 bankruptcy is generally referred to as a reorganization. And then Chapter 13 is personal reorganization, which we're not going to cover in this discussion because it's not directly relevant to a venture, a startup company that runs out of cash. So we're going to walk through Chapter 7 and Chapter 11, and you'll have one short activity to do associated. So in a Chapter 7 liquidation, where the company has run out of money and is unable to negotiate a settlement with its creditors, the company declares bankruptcy and or is forced into bankruptcy by the creditors, and the company then liquidates its assets as best as it can to pay off as many debts as possible. This represents roughly 75% of all business bankruptcy filings. The company is required to provide a list of all of its assets and a list of all of its liabilities and creditors to the court, and then the court has an appointed trustee who makes decisions about all of those assets and where they go. They determine if there are any assets exempt from a forced sale, because there are special classes of assets that may not be covered in a bankruptcy. The trustee then determines if it can and liquidates any remaining assets for cash, and then checks the validity of the claims of any of the creditors who are trying to recoup some of their losses. The court trustee then distributes any of the resulting cash in the priority of the claims, and this is a really important part of any bankruptcy process. It is determining which creditors get access to cash first. So for example, a creditor that has what's called a secured credit, such as a mortgage on a home or a loan on equipment, where the amount owed is specifically tied to an asset, those get their claims paid out first. These are called priority claimants. They also include anything associated with bankruptcy costs, so any individuals or organizations that are serving the company in the bankruptcy process, such as lawyers or accountants, if employees are owed money, or if there are any unpaid taxes. After that are general and unsecured creditors as well as suppliers. And then once this is done, The individual owners of the company are granted a discharge, but this bankruptcy will turn up on their records for 10 years. The corporation ceases to exist, and then at that point, shareholders have no liability to any unpaid creditors. So let's walk through an example. Here we have a company who has $100 worth of assets available to it, but unfortunately it has more than $100 worth of claims on it. There is a secured equipment loan tied to a specific asset. That loan is worth $10. There's a bank loan for $120. Then there are some trade payables which are unsecured. That means they're not tied to a specific asset. These are things that the company purchased but hasn't paid for yet. They could be supplies for manufacturing. They could be long-term service fees. Or something like that. And then finally, there is the $20 of value in stockholder equity. So take a moment and think: how will these creditors be paid out with the $100 of asset value when the company is liquidated? Well, here's the answer. The equipment loan is paid out first because it's a secured credit, and so that $10 gets paid out. Bank debt comes second, and so the bank is going to get $90. Why? Well, because that's all there is. There was only $100 worth of value to distribute. Once that's liquidated and the cash dispersed, there's nothing left. And so the bank will get $90 out of the $100 it's owed, but the folks the creditors with trade payables and the stockholders will get absolutely nothing. And this is the challenge in a bankruptcy of any type, which is very often there's not enough money to go around. This is why as we talked about previously, equity is a higher risk investment than debt, because in situations like this, the creditors who created a debt investment in the company will get their money before the equity investors do. So here's a second example. We have a similar situation of asset value being $100, but a different sets of values associated with the same things. Please go to Canvas either now or after this presentation is over. Complete the quick activity associated with this by identifying how much money each of these creditors will receive during the bankruptcy. This is not actually very difficult, but you can take the quiz as many times as you like until you hopefully get this correct. So now let's talk about Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This is a reorganization. So this is a very different situation. This is where the theory is that a company is unable to pay its debts at the moment, but the owners and managers believe that there's more value in the company operating than in liquidating its assets. And this is a situation very often where companies have experienced a very specific shock, such as an economic recession or some major change in their operations or their market, where there's a lot of value still in the company to operate, but in the very short term it can't pay its debts off. So this represents about 25% of business bankruptcy filings. If it doesn't work out, it can always convert to a Chapter 7 and liquidate. But the idea here is that the company keeps possession of its assets and continues to run the firm, but it's required to file a reorganization plan with the court in order to show the creditors that there is going to be a good faith effort to run the company profitably and pay off the creditors eventually. Again, there is different treatment for different creditor classes, and there has to be a business plan for future financial performance. In this situation, a court may determine that some of the creditors won't get access to all of their payments. This can also be a very challenging situation because it can dramatically change the stock price of a company. This is very much what happened during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. For example, the auto companies were unable to pay their debts as the markets crashed and needed to be reorganized in order to ensure that there was going to be a mechanism for the companies to continue to operate. The different creditor classes have to vote to accept the plan. This can't be forced on creditors. 2/3 of the creditor classes have to agree, representing roughly 1/2 of the claimants. And the goal is that no class should be worse off than under a liquidation scenario. If any one class of creditors is going to be worse off in a reorganization than in a liquidation, then clearly they would prefer the liquidation. This type of bankruptcy requires an enormous amount of negotiating, which can seem sort of strange because you have a company that can't pay its debts, and yet people will spend months or even years arguing about how to reorganize the organization to get it back up on its feet. But it can create a lot of value because if the company can get moving again, it can potentially raise additional capital, restructure some of its prior liabilities, for example, change the due dates on debt or interest rates or guaranteed payments, and then that gives it an opportunity to actually begin functioning again. So generally speaking, a reorganization is preferable to a liquidation. It's just not always possible. So key takeaways about bankruptcy: first of all, it can take different forms, and sometimes it doesn't even mean that the business ceases to exist. We sometimes have this misunderstanding that a bankruptcy means you're out of business. But actually, companies can go bankrupt and still continue to operate and then emerge from bankruptcy. And in fact, many successful entrepreneurs have had unsuccessful earlier ventures. Clearly, bankruptcy should not be a goal, but just because a venture goes bankrupt doesn't necessarily mean that the entrepreneurs were unsuccessful or that they're not competent. And very commonly in situations like the 2008-2009 recession or the pandemic of 2020, many businesses are going to go bankrupt, which were not strictly the fault of the managers, the owners, or the entrepreneurs. So hopefully this gives you a little more information about how bankruptcy actually works.